Make death to America great again.
The small black eye of the camera stared back at me, unblinking. It had been months since I last turned it on, months filled with a silence that matched the emptiness I felt inside. Dust, fine as powdered sadness, covered its casing, showing the days I had let pass by, unrecorded, unshared. My fingers, hesitant at first, wiped away the grey film. It felt like disturbing a grave, this act of bringing it back to life. The world outside my small window hadn't stopped its relentless spin, its descent into a deeper economic gloom. But my own world had shrunk, drawn inward by a weariness that clung to me like the city's perpetual smog. Why start again? The question hung in the stale air of my room, heavy and unanswered. Setting up the rig on my old motorbike, a machine that had seen better days, much like its owner, felt like a betrayal of that quiet resignation. Each clamp tightened, each wire connected, was a small act of defiance against the part of me that whispered, "What's the use?" The streets of Erwan, once a canvas for my adventures, now seemed a landscape of muted struggles, my own included. The rial had plummeted further since my last ride, its value dissolving like sugar in bitter tea, making every spare part, every litre of fuel, a painful sacrifice. The government, for all its talk of diplomacy and reform, had yet to stop the bleeding of our nation's hope. The news painted a grim picture of inflation soaring beyond 50%, of families like mine pushed closer to the edge. The decision to return to vlogging wasn't born of a sudden burst of optimism. It was more a quiet surrender to a stubborn, perhaps foolish part of my spirit that refused to be entirely extinguished. Maybe it was the need to give voice to the silence, to show the world outside the carefully curated news reports what life felt like for an ordinary man on a sputtering motorbike, navigating the labyrinth of a crumbling economy. Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was just the familiar itch in my hands, the muscle memory of the handlebars, the phantom wind on my face calling me back to the only freedom I knew, however illusory it might be in these constricted times. The camera, now perched on its mount, felt heavier than before, burdened not just by its physical weight, but by the unspoken stories it might capture. Stories of resilience, yes, but also of despair, of the daily grind that wore people down, smoothing their resistance into a dull acceptance. As I prepared for that first ride after the long hiatus, the streets outside my window hummed with a nervous energy, a city bracing itself for another day under the heavy sky of uncertainty. The year 2025 was already shaping up to be another chapter in our long book of trials, and I, a reluctant chronicler, was about to ride back into its unfolding narrative, the lens my only witness. The sun in these late spring days of May beat down with a fierce intensity, a sign of the hot summer to come. The heat made the air above the road shimmer, making everything look wavy. Even before starting the engine, sweat would start to form on my skin, a sticky feeling that promised hours of discomfort. Riding in such heat was a test of endurance, a daily struggle against the elements. The wind, when it came, felt like the breath of a furnace, carrying fine dust that covered everything in the city, a constant reminder of the dry land around us and the dry hopes within. Wearing the full-face helmet felt like being in a personal oven. The padding, once comfortable, quickly became a sweat-soaked sponge, sticking to my temples and cheeks. Air vents, made for cooler weather, offered little relief, bringing in hot air that just swirled the heat around my head. Through the narrow visor, the world looked distorted, the vibrant colours of the city dulled by the tinted plastic and the ever-present haze. Breathing became a conscious effort, each breath a sip of warmth, each exhale a steamy cloud fogging the inside of the visor, a constant, annoying reminder of my own physical limits in this harsh climate. Sometimes I would see other riders, mostly young men on smaller, quicker bikes, zipping through traffic with their helmets unstrapped, or worse, perched on the back of their heads like an afterthought. A part of me envied their carefree attitude, the brief breezy break they got from the suffocating heat. But the sensible part, the part that had seen too many roadside memorials, knew the danger of such choices. The heat was tough, but the hard road was even tougher, unforgiving of any mistake. So I endured. The helmet a necessary burden, its weight a constant pressure on my neck and shoulders, another layer to the burdens I already carried. The discomfort was more than just physical, it was a symbol of the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to cover the city. Just as the helmet restricted my vision and muffled the sounds of the city, so too did the broader environment seem to limit our lives, limiting our perspectives, muting our voices. The heat, the dust, the economic pressure, it all blended into a feeling of being under attack, not by a foreign enemy, but by the very conditions of our existence. Every ride was a small act of defiance, a refusal to give in to the inertia that the heat and hardship tried to impose, a journey through a landscape that felt both familiar and increasingly strange. The issue of helmets in Erwan was interesting, a small look into the bigger picture of following rules and quiet rebellion. Officially, wearing one was required, a rule meant for our safety. But like many rules here, its enforcement was inconsistent, depending on the officer or the rider's status. You would see men, often older or those who seemed important, riding with their chins uncovered, their hair blowing in the wind, silently showing they felt above the rules. This selective following of rules was understood by everyone. For me, the helmet was a complex symbol. On one hand, it was a shield, a practical need on chaotic roads where a moment's inattention could lead to disaster. I had seen enough near misses, enough crumpled metal by the roadside to value its protection, however uncomfortable. Yet on the other hand, it felt like a symbol of conformity, another rule from above that one was expected to follow without question. The very act of putting it on, of feeling its enclosing presence, sometimes felt like a small surrender, a bowing to the expected norms, even when my spirit yearned to feel the unfiltered wind, to taste a moment of simple freedom. There were days when the urge to discard it, to ride with the wind screaming in my ears, was almost overwhelming, especially on those long, empty stretches of road outside the city. It wasn't just about the heat, it was about shedding a layer of imposed identity, of being just a man on a machine, free. But then the ingrained caution, or perhaps a deeper, more insidious fear of standing out too much, would take hold. To be visibly non-compliant in even this small way could attract unwanted attention, a scrutiny that, in these tense times, with the economy unravelling and discontent simmering beneath the surface, felt like a risk too great for such a fleeting sensation of liberty. So, the helmet remained a constant companion, its visor reflecting a world I observed with a mixture of affection and deep frustration. It framed my view, quite literally, shaping my perception of the streets I roamed. Sometimes I wondered if this was how society conditioned us all, to accept the constraints, to internalize the rules, until the very thought of breaking them felt alien, even dangerous. The helmet, in its own way, was a reminder of the subtle pressures to conform, to fit into the mold, lest you be singled out, judged or worse, in a society that often seemed to value obedience over individuality, especially when its foundations felt increasingly shaky. There is a special kind of loneliness that comes to a person who chooses to walk a different path, even in small ways. In a city full of traditions and expectations, this loneliness can feel as real as the ever-present dust. My vlogging and solo rides, exploring a life on the edges of mainstream goals, often felt like actions done in isolation. The occasional online comment or a quick thumbs up were like distant stars in a dark sky, briefly comforting but too far away to ease the growing chill of isolation. This feeling of being punished for being different wasn't about direct persecution, not in an obvious way. It was more subtle, a slow loss of connection, a quiet disapproval shown in averted eyes and conversations that avoided my unusual interests. When I talked about my rides and the stories I tried to capture, I often got polite but empty looks, as if I were describing a hobby from another world. In a society struggling with high inflation, where the daily fight for bread and medicine, which were becoming scarce, took up every thought, my search for meaning on two wheels seemed like a silly, almost insulting distraction to many. The falling value of the currency, reaching historic lows, meant that my small earnings from vlogging, if any, were almost worthless. This economic struggle made me feel even more like an outsider. While others went after sensible careers or what was left of them in a world of factory closures and rising unemployment, I was chasing stories, a pursuit that offered little in the way of real security. It was a choice, my choice, but the consequences were always with me. The system, it seemed, had little room for those who didn't directly contribute to its ideas of productivity, or who questioned even quietly the status quo by simply observing it too closely. This isolation wasn't just about my vlogging. It extended to a broader sense of not fitting in with the main trends. The quiet frustrations I felt about the direction of our country, the strict social norms, the widespread corruption that Transparency International ranked us so poorly for, these were feelings best kept hidden. To voice them too loudly was to risk more than just disapproving looks. And so a silence grew, not just around me, but within me too, a protective shell against a world that seemed determined to punish any deviation from its narrow, prescribed path. The echo in that silence was often the sound of my own solitary thoughts, a lonely hum against the roar of the indifferent city. Section 5, Swallowed by the Whale, a modern Jonah's lament. I often thought of the story of Jonah, the prophet who ran away from his mission, only to be swallowed by a big fish. Not because I thought I was a prophet, far from it, but because I understood in my own small way that feeling of being taken over by something huge and unavoidable, of being stuck in the belly of a beast with no clear way out. For me, that beast was not a sea creature, but the very life in Iran, the mix of economic hardship, social pressure, and a feeling of a country lost, much like Jonah in the stormy sea before he was swallowed. The economic crisis, getting worse each month, felt like the dark, tight insides of that whale. Every news report of the rial's further drop against the dollar, now reportedly over 100,000 tomans for a single US dollar, felt like another squeeze of the creature's gut. The rising prices, making basic needs a luxury for many, was the hard reality we had to live with. My attempts to vlog, to find some beauty or meaning in this, often felt like Jonah's prayers from the depths, a desperate call for help, or at least for a bit of light in the overwhelming darkness. The system, full of mismanagement and shady dealings of those who benefited from the chaos, was the whale itself, huge and uncaring about the struggles of those inside. Like Jonah, I sometimes felt I was being punished, not for running from a divine call, but for simply trying to live honestly, for refusing to fully accept the stories fed to us. My vlogging, my quiet observations, my very wish to show the real streets, maybe these were my acts of defiance in a system that preferred obedience and silence. The loneliness I felt, the subtle exclusion, the financial uncertainty of my chosen path. These were the tight spaces of my own personal wail, a result of not fitting in, of not going along with the accepted truths and goals. And just as Jonah eventually cried out from his situation, there were times my vlogs felt like that cry, a message in a bottle thrown into the vast ocean of the internet, hoping someone, somewhere, would understand the pressure of being inside this great, consuming entity. The story of Jonah ends with his reluctant obedience and a message of repentance. I often wondered what my own Nineveh was, what message I was supposed to deliver, or if my fate was simply to be carried along in this darkness, a tiny, insignificant speck tossed about by forces far beyond my control, waiting for a shore I could not yet see. Section 6. Wrestling with Shadows, the System's Unseen Walls. My struggle was not against a single clear enemy, but against a vague force, the system, a mix of cultural rules, religious expectations, slow bureaucracy, and the heavy weight of a failing economy. These were the unseen walls that trapped me, stronger than any physical barrier. Trying to live daily life, let alone do something unusual like vlogging, often felt like fighting shadows. You could feel their presence, their limiting power, but you could never quite hit them, never find a solid grip to push against. It was a slow battle, wearing down the spirit with many small frustrations. The cultural expectations were a constant, subtle pressure. A man of my age was supposed to have a stable job, a family, a clear place in society. My motorbike, my camera, my solo trips, these were seen by many as an extended adolescence, a failure to take on adult responsibilities. Religious rules, often strict and unyielding, shaped public life, dictating behaviour, shaping views of what was proper, and watching anything that seemed different. To document life honestly was to risk stepping on sensitive ground, to accidentally cross invisible lines that could bring unwanted attention from those who saw themselves as protectors of public morality. The economic system, or rather its spectacular failure, was perhaps the most real war. The news of the stock market dropping 34,000 points in a single day in March, the mass exit of private money, these weren't just numbers, they were shocks that shook our daily lives. Getting parts for my old bike became a treasure hunt, with prices changing weekly, sometimes daily. The dream of upgrading my camera gear was just that, a dream, moving further away with every percentage point the Ryle lost. Even the simple act of affording enough fuel for a meaningful ride required careful planning, a constant awareness of the shrinking value of my money, a direct result of years of mismanagement and corruption. And then there was the bureaucracy, a maze designed to frustrate and deter. Any official interaction, from renewing a license to simply trying to understand a new rule, was an exercise in patient-sapping confusion. It felt as though the system was designed to wear you down into compliance, to make you give up on any goal that required its help. This constant friction, this feeling of pushing against an unyielding, indifferent mass was the daily reality. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, grinding weariness, the kind that makes you question if the fight is worth the energy, if the shadows will ever go away. Section 7. The Punctured Dream, Misfortunes on the Road. The road, my supposed safe place, often mirrored the dangers of the larger world. One hot afternoon, miles from any village, deep in the dry hills, the familiar, sickening lurch of a flat tyre brought me to a sudden stop. The hiss of escaping air was like a sigh of resignation from my long-suffering motorbike. Stranded under the harsh sun, the silence of the landscape pressed in, broken only by the buzzing of unseen insects and the frantic beating of my own heart. A simple flat tyre, a common enough problem for any rider, but in that moment it felt like a personal insult, a cruel joke played by a universe indifferent to my struggles. The scarcity and cost of a new inner tube, thanks to the falling real, was an immediate practical worry that overshadowed the physical discomfort. These small problems were relentless, each a tiny puncture in the already deflated balloon of my dreams. A dead battery on a cold morning, the sudden failure of a crucial piece of vlogging equipment impossible to replace locally, a minor traffic fine for an infraction I hadn't committed but couldn't afford the time or energy to contest. They accumulated, each one a grain of sand in the gears of my progress. It wasn't just bad luck, it felt systemic. The failing infrastructure, the lack of quality control on overpriced goods, the general air of neglect. These were symptoms of the larger economic problems affecting Iran, where even electricity shortages were causing daily losses in the millions for the country. I remember one trip where I'd carefully planned a route to capture the spring bloom in a remote valley, a rare splash of colour in our often austere landscape. Halfway there, a sudden fuel shortage in the region, a consequence of some unclear policy shift or distribution failure, left me stranded, my plans dissolving like mist. The frustration was immense, not just at the lost opportunity, but at the sheer unpredictability. The feeling that no amount of planning could safeguard against the random disruptions that had become common. These personal misfortunes were small examples of the larger societal breakdown, where the basic machinery of life seemed to be failing. Each incident, whether a flat tire or a failed filming trip, chipped away at my resolve. It was easy to see them as signs, as warnings to abandon this foolish pursuit. Yet perversely they also fueled a stubborn resistance. To fix that tyre under the blistering sun, using my inadequate tools and cursing the shoddy patch kit I could barely afford, became an act of defiance. It was a refusal to be beaten by the small things, even as the larger forces seemed insurmountable. These misfortunes, while draining, also served as raw material for my vlogs, unvarnished glimpses into the daily grind, a testament to the resilience required just to keep moving forward in a land of punctured dreams. Section 8. Whispers of Dissent, the Indifferent Gaze of Many. While my personal struggles felt intense, I knew I was not alone in my frustrations. Whispers of dissent were everywhere in Urban, like dry leaves blowing down alleyways before a storm. You heard them in the quiet conversations at the bazaar, in the bitter jokes shared over tea, in the tired sighs of merchants watching their livelihoods disappear with the currency. The growing social dissatisfaction was a real thing, a simmering pot whose lid was held down by an increasingly heavy hand. Economists themselves were warning of deep structural problems, a quiet admission of the precariousness of our situation, a situation where the government itself seemed to be in a surrender or collapse scenario. Yet, despite this shared grievance, what often struck me was a pervasive societal indifference, a kind of collective weariness that showed as a shrug of the shoulders. When I would try to engage people, to talk about the things I observed on my rides, not overtly political things, but the human stories, the small injustices, the quiet acts of endurance, I was often met with that same polite detachment. It was as if people had retreated into their own private shells, too consumed by their immediate worries, the price of bread, the availability of medicine, the fear of unemployment that haunted over 20% of the youth, to spare much energy for the concerns of a motorbike vlogger or the larger, more abstract problems of the nation. This indifference wasn't necessarily born of malice or apathy, but of exhaustion. Years of economic hardship, sanctions, internal mismanagement, and the constant pressure to conform had taken their toll, eroding public trust and fostering a sense of powerlessness. Why care about the bigger picture when your own small world was crumbling? Why stick your neck out when the consequences of dissent were so severe and the chances of effecting real change seemed so remote? The social divide was deepening, not just between the rich and the poor, but between those who still hoped and those who had surrendered to a quiet despair. My vlogs, in their own way, were an attempt to bridge this gap, to show that individual stories mattered, that our collective experience was worth documenting. But it often felt like shouting into a strong wind. The official narratives, broadcast through state-controlled media, painted one picture, while the reality on the ground was starkly different. Yet, to openly challenge the official version was a dangerous game. And so, many chose silence or a carefully curated public persona, their true thoughts reserved for the most trusted company. This societal indifference, this collective turning inward, was perhaps the most challenging obstacle of all, a silent, invisible wall that absorbed every attempt at connection, every whispered call for something more. Section 9. The Unending Road, Reflections from a Weary Saddle. The road ahead always stretches, an unbroken ribbon of chances and dangers, much like life here. From the tired seat of my motorbike, after many miles and months that have felt like years, my thoughts are a mix of frustration, bits of hope, and a deep sense of searching. This journey, this vlogging effort, started as a way to share the beauty and the grit of my land, but it has become something more. A personal test, shaping my understanding of my own strength, or maybe my own foolishness, in the face of big challenges. The economic storm shows no sign of stopping. 2025 continues to test our limits, and the path forward remains unclear. I often wonder about my place in this society, this complex, contradictory homeland of mine. Am I just an observer, a detached lens capturing the struggles of others, or am I an active participant in its quiet, unfolding drama? The feeling of isolation, of being punished for my nonconformity, still clings to me, a shadow that grows in the afternoon sun. Yet through the lens, I have also found connection, however brief, with souls who see a reflection of their own unspoken thoughts in my wanderings. These small affirmations are like sips of cool water on a long, dry journey, not enough to quench the thirst, but enough to keep me going for a little while longer. The hardships, the flat tires, the economic worries, the systemic indifference. They are not unique to me. They are the shared burden of a generation dealing with a legacy of broken promises and a future that seems to shrink with each passing day. The news of joining organizations like SCO or BRICS, or the diplomatic dances with regional powers, float like distant clouds, offering little shade from the immediate scorching realities on the ground. Attracting foreign investment, crucial for any recovery, seems a distant dream when the foundations at home are so unstable. My vlogs are but a tiny mirror reflecting these big challenges, a small voice in a chorus of unheard pleas. Maybe there is no grand purpose to my rides, no deep revelation waiting at the end of some dusty trail. Maybe it is enough to simply bear witness, to keep the camera rolling even when the battery is low and the spirit is tired. The road through the economic storm is long and hard, and I, a solitary rider, continue to navigate its twists and turns, unsure of the destination, but driven by an internal compass that points towards the horizon. The engine sputters, the tyres are worn, but for now they still turn. And as long as they do, the story continues, one bumpy, uncertain kilometre at a time. Now like and subscribe, you stupid, ungrateful bums. God, how much I hate you people.